Good evening, everyone. I'm Vanessa Schoenecker. I'm the CEO of the Geelong Regional Libraries, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Geelong Library and Heritage Centre for tonight's event with author Hannah Kent, who will discuss her latest novel, Devotion. And how wonderful to see so many people joining us here for this special event that we're very pleased to present in partnership with Melbourne Writers Festival. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wadawurrung of the Kulin Nations, original owners of the land on which this library stands. We pay respect to Wadawurrung elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge and celebrate First Nations people of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story. I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are with us here this evening. And public libraries are indeed a place to share our stories of historical significance, critical thinking and civic debate. And I'd also like to acknowledge that today marks the end of the Elizabethan era, an epoch of which our stories will be part of for future generations. Vale Queen Elizabeth II. It's wonderful to see a room of smiling faces here tonight, which I think might be symbolic of the optimism that many of us are feeling as we head into spring. A couple of months ago, we made the difficult decision to postpone our Local Word regional showcase event due to the ongoing impacts of COVID in the winter flu season. And so I'm very pleased to confirm that we're looking forward to holding the Local Word on Friday the 18th and Saturday the 19th of November. So lock it into your diaries. The leaflets are there. It's a reiteration, reimagining of what the Word for Word was prior to the pandemic. So we look forward to seeing you all there. Things have definitely changed in the events world during the last couple of years, and we are keen to hear from you about what you'd like us to be programming that we might not have thought about before. So that's why we've asked you to fill in the short survey through the QR code, and we have our book pack valued at $100 that one of you will be receiving at the end of tonight if you filled out that survey, and it might even include a copy of Devotion if you're super lucky. So now to the main event, the reason why we're here, and I'd like to introduce Hannah Kent, thank you. As I'm sure you know, Hannah Kent is the internationally best-selling author of Burial Rites and Good People, and Hannah's here tonight to discuss Devotion, a story that charts the burgeoning love between two girls fleeing religious persecution in Prussia from the 1830s in South Australia. Hannah, I've actually read Burial Rites twice. I read it, and then my son came home and said he was reading it for Year 12 English. It was one of their selected texts.
Oh,
so I know the book.
My condolences.
I know the book very well. I can't say that I remember all the names as well as I should. So The Guardian said of Devotion, it is a love story, ardent and wholesome, and it drapes its reader in lush historical detail. Fans will find a lot to savour. And tonight, please also welcome writer, editor and critic Nadia Bailey, who will be in conversation with Hannah. So please join me in welcoming them both.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Vanessa, and thank you all for being here tonight. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to join you in such a beautiful venue and to discuss this very beautiful book. Before we dive into the discussion, just some brief housekeeping. If you haven't already done so, please turn your phones to silent. But you are, of course, most welcome to tweet, Instagram, TikTok, BookTok, Be Real, or whatever else your social media demands of you. Hannah and I will be in discussion for about 40 minutes, and then there'll be time for you guys to ask questions. So please do make a note of anything you wish to ask. We're also delighted to have Dymocks booksellers here tonight. They will be selling copies of Hannah's book, which she will then be signing at the end of the session. Now, if you haven't read Devotion, you are in for such a treat. It combines the lyricism, lush description, and historical attentiveness we've come to expect from Hannah's work, yet it also breaks entirely new ground. taking us from 1830s Prussia to colonial era South Australia, and introducing us to the singular character of Hannah Nussbaum, a young woman born into a strict religious community. Hannah is out of step with her father's devoted Lutheranism and her mother's wishes for a conventional daughter, and struggles to find her place in the world. Soon she meets Thea Eichenwald, a newcomer to the village who she forms an immediate and profound connection with. As the story unfolds, it takes us from Prussia and the old ways to the new world of Australia in all its beauty and strangeness. This book is a love story, an ode to the natural world, and it will completely upend your expectations about halfway through. And if you've already read the book, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Hannah, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Vanessa.
Now, you're going to read a little bit from the book in just a moment, but before we get to that, I was wondering if you could give us just a little bit of backstory about how this book came to be. What was the original genesis, and when did you first start working on it?
It's funny, you know, I think with my earlier two novels, I always had a very clear idea of what I wanted to do. Both of those books, Burial Rites and The Good People, started out of a fascination with the historical character. So through various circumstances, I had read or encountered, in the first case, Agnes Magnusdottir, in the second, Nance Roche, these women who, in their time, seemed to be marginalised and were certainly, I thought, misrepresented in the limited historical records which mentioned them. And it was really a deep curiosity about these women, particularly what they really were like, beyond that kind of stereotypical misrepresentation of them as wicked, as unequivocally bad, that led me into the novel writing process through, you know, quite rigorous research into their lives and into the worlds that inform their lives. With this book, it was a little bit different. I remember sort of when The Good People came out, sort of returning to my desk after a tour and thinking, oh, I've got to write another book, and immediately feeling quite strongly that I didn't want to do the same thing, and yet that might, you know, that there might be people who wanted me to do that. So by which I mean taking a criminal woman from history and essentially writing her story. I thought, if I do this again, I'm probably going to be painting myself into a corner. Also, those two books, for those of you who have read them will know, they're quite bleak territory. I have a friend who is quite cynical, and she says I write books about miserable people in bleak places. And I kind of wanted to move away from that. I had spent by that stage 6 years, you know, investigating things like executions and, you know, smallpox and, you know, all of this sort of stuff. And I thought, you know, I want to write something now which is a little bit more celebratory in tone. It was also a time that was interesting for me personally because I was living in Melbourne. This was when I was working at Kill Your Darlings, which is a literary magazine there. And I had moved back to the place where I grew up, which is Paramount Country, the Adelaide Hills. And returning back to that exquisite landscape, I fell in love with it again. And I experienced a couple of weeks where I felt like I was a child again. And I felt that was because I was filled with that same kind of wonder I remember this place filling me with as a child. And I thought, I wonder if I can write about it. Maybe the time has come for me to write a book set in Australia. Maybe there's a story I can find that will allow me to essentially, you know, pour my love out for this landscape. And so this book started in so many ways with nature rather than with any particular character. The idea to write about these two young women evolved through quite a long process, really, which started with thinking about stories in my local area, things that I might enjoy writing about, but also things that I could potentially celebrate within these narratives. And one of the things that struck me quite early on was that when I was living in Melbourne, no one knew what I meant when I said things like Metwurst and Fritz and, you know, Fetischleisen. I mean, and it made me realise how much we still to this day in South Australia have this kind of inherited German lexicon, but also a sort of an inherited culture of German, you know, cuisine and wine, like in the Barossa and so forth. And I thought, maybe I could write about this. And I was also really interested with this narrative, and I realise this is a very long answer to your question.
It's fine.
I was also really interested in looking at these because I knew, having grown up in the area, that many of the Adelaide Hills sort of villages had been formed by Prussians who were old Lutherans in their homeland and had been persecuted for not subscribing to King Frederick William III's New Union Church. And their persecution, initially it was voluntary to subscribe to the church and join it and and adopt the Union Service Book, and eventually it wasn't. And people had been imprisoned, they had been fined, the services that they led had gone into forests and so forth. And I thought, what's interesting about this is that their persecution feeds so much into the narratives and the memorialisation of these communities in the Adelaide Hills. But it's always kind of troubled me, because the way in which these persecuted people have been remembered is to count their virtues. They were so hardworking, they were so pious, they suffered so much, and to kind of completely disregard the fact that they in turn, by taking up land in the newly colonised South Australia, were completely persecuting First Nations and Indigenous peoples. And so I thought that's an interesting thing to explore in historical fiction. I don't want just to adopt a colonising story for its own sake. So that was kind of the first start. And then I started thinking, okay, what to celebrate in amongst all this? Well, friendship between women. I'm descended from, on my grandmother, my father's mother's side, from these German communities. And she was a really interesting person, and she never said anything about herself. And maybe I can sort of claw back this hagiographic kind of memorialisation of the pious old Lutherans and find something juicy in the friendships between women and how they must have sustained them. And then the plebiscite happened, and then I changed my mind. I might stop there before I just keep going on. But that was essentially the journey of how this book evolved. It was a much slower process, but it went from basically nature to the Prussian communities, and then finding something within them that I could make the focal point of this story.
Wonderful. I'll let you take a sip of water, and then I would love for you to read us a section.
Certainly. So I guess this is quite a good section, speaking of how I wrote so much of this book as a way to, I guess, solidify my great love of the place where I now live. The sound of this country is one long sustained note that does not end. It is a humming that holds all the other music of this place in harmony. Every other sound is threaded upon it. It was at the port that I began to curate new litanies. Between the bullock drivers that rumbled in from Adelaide, the sailors, the merchants, the English come in search of labourers, I found words given to the music I heard against the constant run of the wind amongst the rushes and sand dunes. She-oak for the tree with long-scaled needles, whistling the wind in a way that made my skin lift. Magpie lark for the two shriek-calling peep in changing hours. Salt paper bark for the crooked trees groaning wooded cupped fruit. Mangrove, wattle, saltbush. In the months that came afterwards, I learned new words, as we all did, as we crossed the dusty ticking plains of Adelaide. I placed them next to one another upon the deeper vibration of this country. Galah, cockatoo, lorikeet, kangaroo, wallaby, possum, emu, goanna, quoll. Now, years later, sitting on the lip of this valley, I can make prayer beads of the trees that crown me, the small living things glimpsed if I am still and silent. Red gum, blue gum, quandong, stringy bark. And the birds, ever here, ever singing. A liturgy to govern the hours towards gods of cry and shriek and call, kookaburra, magpie, shrike thrush, wagtail, currawong, crow, bubuk. Scripture may no longer roll off my tongue in smooth certainty, but my mouth is still full of spirit. Holy writ of living things, each one a prayer against the teeth. Nature had always been my whetstone, had always made me keener. And after the congregation reached the foothills, I felt myself sharpen. The landscape on the ascent to the ranges was unlike anything I had ever seen before. I had thought the pine forest back in Kay a place of divinity, but this country was infinitely more sovereign. Each morning, while it was yet dark, the birds filled the air with singing, so that the sun, when it rose, brought light as symphony. The birds were everywhere, hosts of raucous angels, black-bodied, yellow-topped messengers of shrieking delight, soot-streaked coral masters, feather-fat kookaburras suddenly, alarmingly proselytizing to the dawn. Even the trees grew in such a way as to welcome the sun to the world. In Prussia, canopies were dense and thick. Forest floors were deeply shadowed. Here was a place of lightness. Leaves dappled thin and shiny, fluttered pink, grey, green. I crushed them in my palm and smelled medicine, healing. Hot, still days dropped branches, all bone crack, and brought the sounds of bees. Sometimes I smelled honey warming the air. Animals were muscled fur and liquid eyes, or scaly thicknesses, tongues darting. All of it, trees and possums and kangaroos and bright beads of ants circling trunks, veered from stillness to flashing movement in an instant. There was energy here, rough softness. Sometimes it rained, and when it stopped, the air was perfume, a clean scent of wet leaf and damp sweetness. I wanted to drink that washed summer air. I imagined it tasted of reprieve. My father, too, was invigorated by everything he saw. He ran his fingers along the ground and filled his nails with soil. "God's gifts," he said, smiling at Matthias. Papa's voice in prayer was the first to interrupt the dark. He scaled the ridges with kingdom-come strides and remarked aloud upon the extravagance of sunlight, the yawning orange of rock faces, the views that suddenly appeared when the trees fell away to vistas that stretched to a shining belt of sea. He wore the hardship of the journey like a hair shirt. The wonder and the deprivation and the physical toll were bringing him closer to God. It was all sanctification. I ended there.
Thank you so much for that. As we've heard from that excerpt, Hannah has a very unique voice and a different way of seeing the world. Can you tell us a bit about who she is and how you went about developing that voice?
Yeah, it took me a long time actually, which was very frustrating because with my earlier novels, again, I had started with character and I had started with voice. Before I'd done any research, I had a very strong sense. And the voice of Hannah really eluded me until I pivoted from what I had been planning to do. I'd been writing a lot of scenes, a lot of sort of descriptive work, but it had been in third person. I hadn't attempted first person yet. And then it was 2017 and we had the plebiscite, and I was unprepared for the amount of anger I would feel during that time when I had horrible pamphlets turning up in me and my now wife's letterbox when I was pregnant with our first child. And the anger at first made me feel impotent as a writer because I started thinking, what can I do? I need to be an activist. I'm not doing anything. If I'm angry, imagine the people who are unsupported or don't have access to community, how are they feeling? And then I sort of had to stop and have a stern talk with myself because I do believe that storytelling is a very powerful thing to do. And so I thought, well, if this is the only form of agency available to me, then I need to storytell. And that was the moment that I shifted from a focus on friendship, a possible focus between friendship between women, to a love story between women. And I wanted, specifically in telling this queer love story, to sort of answer back to the silences that so often we can inherit, as queer people, and that can be incredibly isolating. It can be a really sorrowful process when you realise that the stories were there but they haven't been kept. And so devotion then became an exercise in representation for myself, for myself as a younger closeted queer person, but also for other people who might want that kind of representation. And in that representation, I wanted joy. I wanted to try and circumvent a narrative of shame, which I knew was already going to be quite hard to do because I'd already decided on, setting my story amongst a congregation of very religious people in the 1800s. But I thought, this is something that I can do. And as soon as I realised that this is what I wanted to do, I sat down and I thought, I've got to switch this to first person. I've just got to try and capture the voice of the central figure. And I wrote a paragraph, just in a sort of a flow state. And afterwards I read it, I said, that's it, that's her voice. And I cut out that paragraph. I printed it and cut it out in my notebook. And every time I felt like I was losing my way, I would turn back to it as kind of like as a cornerstone, really, of the novel and as a touchstone for finding my way back into what I felt was true and necessary to it. But the whole time I thought, this paragraph's never going to actually make it in the book. It's a bit too weird. But now it's the first paragraph in the entire novel. I couldn't let it go.
That's fantastic. The other interesting part of this book, or one of many interesting parts, is that aside from this very beautiful relationship between the two girls, there's also Hannah's relationship with her twin brother, who's the most important person in her life until Taya arrives. And as siblings, they're kind of extraordinarily close. What did you want to capture in this sort of familial relationship?
I think as if I found the voice of Hannah through realising that it was a love story. I found the rest of the novel, I found the cohesive arc of the novel through looking at devotion and love in its myriad forms, whether that is, you know, a devotion to God in a very sort of organised religious sense, or whether it's a devotion to God in a wilder nature-based sense, whether it's devotion to family, whether it's devotion to a friend. And one of the things that has been, I guess, you know, really important in my life is I have a younger sister and we're very close. And sometimes I think, you know, as a society, we often uphold romantic love as the most important type of love, and I don't necessarily think that's true. I think other relationships can be just as significant and can carry the same kind of higher meaning that we seek for when we look for things to be devoted to. And so I wanted to capture some of that sibling, what it is like to love and be loved by a sibling and to have that closeness in that relationship. And also I ended up deciding making them twins because I thought how interesting to have, how better to explore the differences and the feelings of being an outsider that Hannah experiences by giving her a twin, someone who, you know, is completely different to her, but also seems to be able to conform to the expectations of that community in a way that she can't. You know, how much greater the pressure when, you know, you are the twin who can't do that. You
spoke a little bit about some of your motivations for setting the book in Australia. I wondered if there were any particular challenges you came up against with this novel that you didn't with the others.
Oh yeah, I found this book really challenging. In fact, there have been several times where I thought to abandon it altogether because I didn't want to. I know some writers have sort of disparate feelings about this, but I feel quite strongly for myself that it is not my place to write from the perspective or to take up the voice or appropriate the culture of any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples, any First Nation peoples in my books. And so that left me with the only option of adopting a white perspective, which given the historical context is a colonising perspective. And the problem is when you write from someone's perspective or you have a character and you're writing from their perspective, you have to kind of, to a certain degree, adopt certain ideological, you know, you don't want the book to be too anachronistic. You need to stay true to the time. And I had so little interest in adopting a colonising attitude and writing from that space. So that was something I really struggled with. I thought, is there a way that I can essentially apply a contemporary understanding of how problematic colonialism is and the continuing it damage does from essentially a colonising character? And so that was a massive part of my struggle in writing this book. And to this day, you know, I still wonder whether there's a different way that I could have done it. But what it ended up pushing me to do was to take creative risks that I don't think I had done in my other books. And I think so much of the middle section of the novel was my way of trying to dislocate characters from the worldview of that time in order to adopt a more far-reaching perspective and understanding, essentially to broaden the very narrow perimeters of their thought. Yeah.
It's actually so interesting you say that. I was going to bring up a quote later, but I'll talk about it now. I read an interview with Hilary Mantel recently where she had some advice for writers of historical fiction, and she said, learn to tolerate strange worldviews, don't pervert the values of the past. Generally speaking, our ancestors were not tolerant, liberal or democratic, and so I find it really interesting that you have done exactly the opposite of that.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I think I'm really interested in all the things Hilary Mantel says about writing historical fiction, because she has very firm ideas about it, and I do agree with her. I think there's something very dissatisfying as a reader when you encounter a character and their worldviews, however similar they might be to you, it's not gratifying, it grates. That's why I felt I needed to actually, in some ways, kind of break free from the genre in a certain way. And I kind of consider this book to be a contemporary book, despite its historical setting, because it, you know, there's some, I guess we could call it magical realism. There's some interesting things that I've tried to do intently to sort of give myself permission to do exactly what she's telling me not to do.
It's all right. I'm sure she would love this book.
I'll never meet her. She'll never be disappointed in me. It's okay.
So we've talked a little bit about Hannah's sort of faith in the natural world, but there's also other forms of worship in this book. The faith of the townsfolk is a really driving force in this novel. both the devout Lutheranism of Hannah's family and also the beliefs held by Taya's mother, who practices a kind of more esoteric version, what we might think of as folk magic. Could you tell us a little bit about this aspect of the work?
The folk magic aspect, or the various sort of...
Whatever you feel.
Well, the folk magic thing was a really interesting thing. For those of you who have read my second novel, there's a lot about folk magic in that book. It's essentially about, fairy doctors and Irish folklore and sympathetic magic. And I went down very deep into that rabbit hole and really enjoyed the process, really enjoyed writing about it, and was very clear that when I had decided to focus on a religious congregation that I wasn't going to touch on any of that stuff again. And this is the funny thing about research, right, is that you set out with a series of questions that you think you're going to find answers to. And in my experience is always that you end up finding all this material you were completely unprepared for, but is so good, you have to include it in the novel. And one of the things I kept coming across were allusions to a grimoire, a book of magic called the 6th and 7th books of Moses, which I kept on encountering it through, written sources, written documents, the archives, anecdotal evidence. This was the 7th book. There was supposed to be this apocryphal text, as dictated to Moses by God on Mount Sinai. And the 7th book was largely herbal cures. And the 6th book was a little bit darker. It involved things like how to invoke spirits to do, your dark bidding and how to raise the dead and things like that. And this book was mentioned so often because it was possessed by so many members of the community. They brought it out from Prussia and they would have special places in their house to hide it in, because pastors would routinely go around and try to find these books. And then sometimes if people were suspected of even having the book, say if they died, people would do things like drop their coffins 3 times before burying them, just in case there was any evil sort of attached to them. And so I sort of made a note of this book and think, I'm going to have to find a copy. This keeps on coming up. It's kind of, I'm not doing my job as a researcher if I don't include it. And then I came across the Vens, who were sort of a Slavic minority who often married into these Prussian families and were also old Lutherans, but were always sort of the subjects of suspicion when it came to the books of the 6th and 7th books of Moses. And then I started, I met with this historian who was actually able to show me a place where one of these books had been hidden in one of the original cottages in these sorts of villages. And then she was also telling me all of these ghost stories, and these families had names and dates. Yeah, this family, they definitely practiced witchcraft. Once people used to walk past their house and they would always have rope ends slung over the side of a chair, and they would be milking the rope ends and milk would be coming out the ends. And meanwhile, up the road, so-and-so's cow's gone dry. And, this is how they're stealing it. And people were really frightened. They never had children, sign of witchcraft. People would wear red ribbons around their neck. Oh, and also on this particular street in Harndorf, which is a real street, a real place, there was a good witch and there was a bad witch, and the bad witch would always be hexing people and, making people's aprons turn into birds, and everyone would always have to turn their clothes inside out when they walked past it on their way to the good witch to undo the hexes. And I was sort of thinking, oh my God, I cannot escape this. It's everywhere. So in the end, I thought, again, just to be bound to my material, I need to include a character who can somehow carry this aspect of this community and their life. And that became Taya's mother, who is a Vend, called Anna Maria. And she's one of my favourite characters, actually. And in many ways, she provided, I guess, a good insight into the counterpoints to, again, those dominant sort of perhaps misunderstanding we have about these groups that we inherit in memorials and in, school texts and local histories and things like that.
Much of your work is concerned with the lives of women during the mid-1800s. So Burial Rites is set in 1829, The Good People is 1825, and Devotion kind of spans the mid-1830s. So I'm curious in how you came to understand this time period as your primary material and what it is that kind of keeps drawing you to that particular era.
It's funny, I think it's an accident, to be honest. Burial rites, like I said, it started with hearing about this woman, the last person to be executed in Iceland, who was executed in 1830. So it's not a spoiler, by the way. It says it on the blurb. But, it was an interest in her. And then I was like, well, I guess I got to find out about, Iceland in the 1830s or 1820s. And then as a process of researching that book, I started reading English newspapers to see if anyone had reported the execution or the crimes involved in that whole series of events in an English newspaper, as they sometimes did. And that was only really because I was very bored of translating things from Icelandic because it's such a slow process. So I thought, I'll give myself the day off and read things in English. And it was when I was reading these old newspapers, didn't find anything about Agnes, but read this little article about a woman called Nance Roach who considered herself a fairy doctor and had used it as a means of defence in a criminal trial. And then was thinking, oh God, you know, did she believe that? Was she trying to get off using sort of a crazy defence? And if she did believe it, what would the world have looked like to her? And so that then led to The Good People. And I think, again, that when I thought, oh yeah, I'm interested in looking at the Prussians, these were the years that they came out. But all that said, I do think that this was a particularly interesting and potent time, the years, sort of the tail end of the Industrial Revolution and the period of time that afterwards. And I think it's because there had been such rapid change, and for the first time, you know, you can research stuff and historians will disagree with me, I know, but I think generally speaking, people's ways of life didn't change that rapidly across the generations. And suddenly you had massive changes in terms of literacy. You had real discrepancies between urban centres where, you know, change was felt, I think, much more immediately. And suddenly they're grating up against these old ways in regional and rural areas. And you see that in things like in The Good People, where people still really held on tightly to folkloric beliefs, and fairy magic and sympathetic magic, but people in the town centres who had benefited from, you know, the Industrial Revolution or new wealth, or who had simply been, you know, received greater education, was suddenly thinking, this is madness. Like, how can you believe this? So you had, I guess, a greater sort of, it was, I guess, the time where you had things like oral cultures die. You had mass migration across the world, people leaving Europe, people going to Canada, people going to America. I mean, these Prussians nearly went to Russia. I just think it was a time of great movement and change in a way that perhaps the world hadn't seen before. But that's also a very, very broad, you know, suggestion. Really, it's just coincidence.
So you might shock us all and write a completely different time period sometime in the future.
Yeah, maybe a contemporary novel. As a representative from my publisher here, I probably shouldn't say too much though.
So you spoke a little bit about the grimoire that played a big role in writing this story, but there's so much other kind of rich historical detail that goes into it, straddling the kind of old Lutheran history, seafaring in the 19th century. Were there any other documents that proved very important in writing this book?
Yeah, there was one in particular. So I'd probably say it was probably the 6th and 7th books of Moses. When I had to translate that from the German, which is the language I don't speak, so that was a very slow process. And there was actually a time when it was sort of midnight. I wrote a lot of this book in the wee hours, and I was translating the German invocation for summoning a devil, and I thought, I really hope that writing it is okay. I'm not saying it out loud. So that book was really important. That fed into so much of the narrative. For those of you who've read the book will see its importance. The other book that really helped me start to see these groups of people as people and not as sort of the Lutherans that I'd heard about growing up in the hills was a captain's log. Captain Dirk Hahn, whom Hahndorf is named after. He wrote this log accounting for the 6-month journey from Hamburg to Port Misery, as Port Adelaide was then known, for very obvious reasons. And this proved real. I mean, I started reading it because I knew I was going to have to write something of the journey, and I hadn't, you know, I've never been on a boat like that. I have no idea what that experience is like, and it was something I was really struggling to visualise. So I was reading this captain's log, you know, trying to take account of what, like, the layout of the ship and also the passengers, which he did mention, but every time he mentioned them, he'd say things which were very dry and kind of, you know, not very colourful, like, oh, you know, they're very pious, they sing all the time, they pray all the time, they're not misbehaving. And I'm like, oh, that's annoying, I wish someone did. And anyway, I was sort of combing through this journal, reading it for sort of, I don't know, the weather, things that he commented, thinking, maybe I'll just skip the journey and just have a part 2. But then towards the end of this this captain's journal, he says, I think that I need to address the behaviour of the emigrants. I have not been as honest as I ought to have been regarding their behaviour. And I was like, Here we go. And then there was like this whole list of all these grievances and terrible things which had happened during the 6 months. And he explains that the reason he had decided belatedly to record them is because when they docked in Port Adelaide, some of these arguments and conflicts were so ongoing and so intense that he thought they would go to trial and he would have to act as a witness. So he had recorded them for his own, to remember in case that happened. And I mean, these conflicts were incredible material. And for those of you, again, who have read the book will recognise, the incompetent doctor who was accused by parents of having put ground glass in the medicine he gave to their children, who also wanted to introduce a live smallpox vaccine, try it out, on the passengers while at sea, which the captain very quickly squashed. People old grievances from the village where many of these passengers came up again, like someone's bull who was not very good in begetting other cows, and yet someone had still charged for the services. And this conflict, in fact, led to blows, and then the congregation split. And at one point during the ship's journey, one half of the congregation was at one end of the ship, the other was at the other, and they were trying to out-sing each other during services. So, I mean, this book was wonderful because it did give me that glimpse of the very human face behind these people that I was researching. And it also just gave me some fantastic stories that, to be honest, I don't think I could have invented myself. So everything which is a bit strange or weird or, dramatic during the ship's journey in devotion is actually completely stolen from this captain's log. It all happened, including the pig, including someone falling down the hatchway, the suffocation when things are battened over, all of that stuff happened.
Wow. You obviously love the process of historical research. I read a quote recently from Lucy Sante where she said, "If you know too little, what you write will be halting and opaque, and if you know too much, it will be dead on the page, a mere transcription after the fact." How do you go about finding that balance in your own work?
Yeah, I think I certainly agree with the first half of her statement. Research, I think, is really vital for me. I have to see something, so I have to be able to visually imagine it before I can write it. And in order to be able to do that, I feel I need to be very familiar with the time period that I'm researching. So that involves at least a year of reading. And it's not just documents held in the archives. It's not just sort of formal published books of history and so forth. I'll read recipes. I'll find out proverbs from the time, letters, anecdotal evidence. I don't even mind if it's a bit dodgy on the facts because I research so much I can soon identify what might be influenced by prejudice or which is just plain incorrect. But my tendency is to find out too much. I sort of see it as, this will be the book, but I want my knowledge to be able to go the whole way around. And I guess the way, when she says it'll be, was it dead on the page? I think my way of avoiding the death is to try and forget some of that knowledge. So I often, when I'm researching, I always have my characters in mind, and then I do stop. I don't continue researching while I'm writing the book. To some extent, I want my short-term memory to drop everything which isn't relevant to character. So when I write, I'm drawing on that familiarity, but my focus is not on the period, it's on the characters and what they're doing on the page, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's kind of an intentional forgetting. And I, if it is relevant, I will remember it, but I do try to sort of drop everything else too. But I do, as a reader, I really love reading historical fiction where you get a very strong sense that the writer knows more than what they're letting on, that there are lives and places extending beyond the pages of the book.
Fantastic. We will go to your questions in just a minute, so do start thinking about them. But before we do that, one more from me. So I don't want to give away too much, but there's something that happens sort of midway through the book that means Hannah undergoes a kind of radical change in perspective and also in some ways is moved away from the central drive of the narrative. Were there challenges you faced in adopting this perspective and how did you negotiate them?
To be honest, no. I don't think it was too challenging. I think making the decision was challenging for me because it felt like a big point of difference for me as a writer. It felt like new ground and I wasn't sure if first of all, I wasn't sure if I could do it. Secondly, I wasn't sure if readers would trust me. I felt, it's quite hard to talk about without saying anything, but I knew that some people would feel like I had picked them up and dropped them off the side of the cliff as a reader, and I didn't know if people would trust that I would catch them which I felt like I would do. And look, I've received emails from people who have said that they did not feel caught, and, you know, people who take issue with things you do often get in touch. But also so do people who sort of, you know, I've heard from lots of people who said, I couldn't believe what you did, but then I realised that it had to be that way, or I felt secure and, like, you know. So, but yeah, that was a big part, I think. It was wondering if people would trust me to do that shift. And the second part, there was a first initial part of, can I do it? And then once I sort of gave myself permission to, it was actually the easiest part of writing the book. It was so enjoyable as someone who has always been very faithful to the written record to do what I did and to indulge, I guess, in some, you know, some slightly wackier, oh God, this is so hard, some wackier stuff. But just to be able to see, look, just to explore the various ways that you can tell a story and to indulge my imagination in a way that I realised when writing the book that I hadn't actually done to a large degree in the other books. You know, in terms of a point of creation, a creation of narrative. I've always been so wedded to the facts and the things that had that happened. So that was actually the most gleeful aspect of writing the book. I feel like I also have to mention that I had a son in 2020, and my daughter also doesn't sleep very well, and so was severely sleep deprived, especially during the writing of that section, which I think, one, undoubtedly has influenced it in terms of tone and style, but also I think gave me a very wonderful sense of, oh, who cares, just do it, I don't have time to worry about it. So yeah, I think that's probably been a factor as well.
Fantastic. Now, I've asked that question very specifically to remind you all, if you have questions, to please phrase them in such a way that there are no spoilers. So we will go to questions now. I will ask you to raise your hands if you have one, and there will be roving microphones. We've got one in the front here.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I did. Actually, there was a time quite early on where I was hoping to take real people from that community and write about them. And what I understood very quickly was that would be a grievous error, because I would get something wrong and people would write to me about their great-great-grandfather and be quite ticked off. And so I very intentionally fictionalised all the characters in this book, which again was something that I hadn't done. But that was also because there was so much information. The lives of these people and their families and the journey of emigration and what happened once they arrived in the colony of South Australia has been very well preserved, both in, you know, informal oral ways, through oral storytelling, and also in formal ways too. I mean, the Lutheran Church has kept, you know, exemplary records. So I did touch on it to a certain degree, because I wanted to obviously find out the facts and you know, use that information to colour the lives of my fictionalised characters. But I did realise very early on that if I were to use real people, that someone would take issue with it, and I didn't have the energy, to be honest. But it was really freeing to then be able to come up with my own characters again, so not something I had really been able to do in the past. But yeah, there's a lot of information out there. There was hardly anything for Burial Rites and the Good People. I was used to a dearth of information and very poignant silences, but this was, you know, there was a lot. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
More questions? Yes, just here. Sorry, wait for the microphone if you wouldn't mind.
I listened to Devotion as an audiobook. Did you have a lot of say in, or did you get to pick who the narrator was?
No. No is the short answer. No. No, I also haven't listened to it, but that's got nothing to do with the narrator. It's got everything to do with me cringing at, you know, edits I didn't make. But no, but I've heard lots of lovely feedback from readers, but no, my publisher makes that decision. Don't know why they don't ask me.
Yes, just here.
I'm also terrified. I asked the question because I'm not at that halfway point, so I don't know what to expect. So I asked with some trepidation, sort of, how much of kind of you, Hannah Kent, kind of is in Hannah the character, because, I don't know, what's the coincidence, you know?
The name, yeah.
The name and sort of, other parts, but yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot, to be honest. I think there are many writers who say that every book is sort of thinly disguised stuff about themselves or their family, and I've never really felt that way at all. But I think it's changed with this book. Hannah was actually called something else during the writing of it, and then I changed it at the end because it seemed it was historically inaccurate, the name I had chosen for her. And so I in the drafting process, I changed it to Hannah as, same name as her mother, Johanna. And then I thought, well, I'll have to change it because people will be thinking all sorts of things, because it's, it just seems very egotistical to kind of have such a similar name. And then I just forgot to change it, really. and then my editor mentioned it, and I thought, oh, yeah, it's quite late in the day to change the character. And by that stage, I think I had realised that there was a lot of, particularly my younger self in the younger Hannah, particularly, I always felt like I'd been beamed in from another planet when I was a kid. I very much felt like an outsider. I was a strange person. I was out in the Adelaide Hills talking to trees. So I felt that quite secure, I guess, in keeping that name for her. And I think there's a lot of my perhaps adolescent insecurities shared by that character. There's certainly a lot of my family. My family have read the books, and they'll be reading pages and they're sort of like they'll recognise the inside jokes and things like that. So yeah, it feels a lot more close to the bone than other ones.
Yes, just down in the front. Just wait for the microphone.
I don't know if it's a question, it's sort of more of an observation, but I really love the way you set up their relationship, because she finally found someone who got her, and I really liked that. The other part I was thinking through the whole thing was, if anyone found out about their relationship, they would have been crucified. So it was it felt like they were always just skirting a knife, even though, and I was sort of wondering why no one picked it up, really. That's my observation anyway.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. It was, I would argue that there are characters who pick it up in a way that they don't ever say. It was my intention for some of the other characters to be aware of at least the depth of their feelings for one another, even if they perhaps lack the language to articulate the nature of that feeling. And that was also a challenge too, in terms of the way that the girls felt about each other, understanding that they too would have lacked a lexicon to speak to it. But it was my very firm choice at the same time that I decided I wanted to, skirt shame. I wanted to avoid this being a narrative of ostracism or excommunication or self-reproach or anything like that. I also wanted the characters to eventually be very clear-eyed about their nature, not to be like, best friends are great, aren't they? And just to kind of continue on that thread without ever really being honest with themselves. I wanted this clarity of intention. But yeah, I think certainly it would have been a very difficult time, and there's a reason why I never encountered any other queer stories set amongst this congregation or from this time. I mean, that inherited silence, so much has been intentionally silenced, so much has been kept. So yeah, thank you very much for that observation. But it was something that I was quite adamant. I thought there's no point in me, if I want to include a narrative which can be uplifting, which can be about kind of queer joy, I need to be able to find out a way that I can do this without it making about, two girls who are completely pillarised by their community.
And just down here in the front, we'll wait for the microphone.
I think my mum and I collectively, we got 4 copies of Devotion for Christmas. There's a passage where Hannah describes, or she's looking at her son sleeping and thinking about what kind of man he's going to be. I think it's the most beautiful thing. And I'm wondering if you could read it.
Oh, wow. I have to do a quick scan to make sure there's no spoilers as well. You don't happen to have the page number, do you? I don't know where it is. Look, I think I'm probably going to have to take too much time. I don't think I will be able to read it until I just come upon it. But I will say about that you know, I mentioned I had a son, and mentioned this book is quite personal. You know, I think you can make the connection. But thank you so much for saying that. It was, you know, it sounds kind of sappy sometimes, but there are moments, I think, in the writing experience where you feel like you are capturing something and it feels like an emotional experience. You lack the detachment that you sometimes do when you're having a critical eye about your own work, and I feel like that was certainly one of the times where that happened to me. But yeah, I think, I'm sorry, it's going to take me far too long to find that exact chapter. If it was a Word doc, perhaps, but but thank you so much for saying that.
Maybe have time for one more question. Anyone has any final? Yes, just up the back here.
Thank you. Hannah, I just wondered, your books have such intricate plots. When you start writing, do you know where you're going from the start, or is there some creativity along the way?
Oh, thank you so much for your question. Yeah, I don't know what I'm doing. I have a friend who is a very meticulous plotter, and I always admire her for that because I think it's such an expedient way to write a book. You know, she just simply rocks up and sees what she has to do for that day and writes that scene. And my processes couldn't be further from that. You know, I have a focus on character, and I feel like when I start, I know my characters very well, but in terms of what's going to happen to them, yeah, not so much. I often have I can liken it to sort of beacons along a very foggy road where I think I'm going to get to this point, but I have no idea how I'm going to get to. So with that in mind, I'm a massive rewriter. I tend to do about 12 drafts. Sometimes I measure my stack of printouts and they're about level with this chair. So this is why it takes me too long to write books. But yeah, that's basically the process, is rarely a continuation of characterization. That's more or less nailed through the research process. But it is definitely just a honing of that plot. And plot is really, you know, the sum of characters and their desires and the things that frustrate those desires and their response to that. So essentially it's negotiating that. And that's why I think it would take me even longer if I didn't know who my characters were. But yeah, no, it's certainly something. But I like that, right? I like the surprise. That's what makes writing an exciting thing for me, is because I sit down. I mean, terrifying too, but you sit down and you think, I have no idea what's going to happen to them today. But I like to think that if I can surprise myself, maybe the reader will be too.
So just to finally wrap everything up, could you tell us what you're working on next?
I'm actually doing a lot of screenwriting this year. So I've just done another third draft of the adaptation of The Good People, which has been a really interesting process, adapting the book. Very humbling experience. And I'm set to do some more screenwriting. Also this year, on another project, another screen project, Run Rabbit Run, is a psychological thriller starring Sarah Snook and directed by Dana Reed, which was shot earlier this year. It's been really lovely to be part of that project. I wrote the very different again. Wrote it when I was pregnant this time and had terrible morning sickness, hence the psychological thriller aspect of it. Yeah, so that's been great. But it's been actually really lovely to be able to move between screenwriting and novel writing. They're so different, but I feel like they both make me a better writer. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, let me just hand back to Vanessa to wrap everything up. Thank you so much, Hannah.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hannah and Nadia. Excuse me. And I could understand why you would ask Hannah to read something, because I was so moved when you read that piece at the beginning. I felt that I was there listening to the birds at dawn. So thank you very much for that.
Oh, thank you.
Now, very exciting, come to the draw of the person who is going to win this beautiful bag of books. If you filled out the QR code for us, the 4 questions. And the person who won it is Janine van der Meer. Thank you, Janine, and thanks for filling that out, because we really are keen to hear what you would like us to do next. And so tonight's event has been recorded, so if you'd like to watch or listen to this discussion or recommend it to friends and family, it will be on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. And we're pleased to have staff from Dimmicks at Warm Ponds joining us tonight at the back selling the copies, so please take the opportunity to purchase a copy and have it signed before you leave. And of course, Devotion is also available to borrow from our library. So thank you everyone for coming along tonight and enjoying our event with Hannah and Nadia.